Greetings, acolytes! Welcome. Please do make yourself comfortable as I tell you an obscure chapter of human history, the so-called blood libel of Tiszaeszlár. For a start, you might ask, what is a blood libel? And just, what the hell is a Tiszaeszlár? Great questions. Let me indulge your thirst for knowledge. Blood libels are superstitious accusations of people. They emerged from medieval Europe and generally contained accusations against Jews ritually sacrificing Christian children to use their blood for the Passover unleavened bread called matzah. Though this was mostly a Christian anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, we can find examples from other places. Disclaimer for anyone wondering, no, the recipe of matzah doesn't contain blood. It very specifically doesn't contain blood. Now, Tiszaeszlár is a small, unassuming village in eastern Hungary. Today, having a barely higher population than 2000, nobody really would think that around 130 years ago, this settlement was the center of international attention. Before I go on, I do have to mention that most sources are in Hungarian and I will have to paraphrase a lot. Besides that, as far as I've managed to unravel it, much of the original documentation about the court case itself was lost during the fire of the National Archives in 1945, so I have to rely on a lot of secondary accounts about the case. I will put the citations in the description as usual, but this will, of course, make it for non-speakers of God's chosen language, Hungarian, difficult to double-check it, which I do acknowledge and ask for trust here. Any native speakers might correct me in the comments if I mess up, though I will attempt not to do that, of course. There are two important books also on the topic, which I will talk about and put in the description, one by the lead detective of the case and the other by the attorney leading the defense. The one by the detective is a terrible read and was almost certainly tampered with it when it was published 19 years after his death in the anti-Semitic background of 1930s Hungary to attack a man long dead and unable to defend himself. The other had a vested personal, political and legal interest in proving the accused innocent, though I haven't finished either of them by the time this video comes out, only going back to them to supplement, contextualize and occasionally check what I've mostly already finished writing by the time I managed to find them and put my hands on them. With that out of the way, let's establish some context. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was an odd place. A hodgepodge of different peoples ruled under the crown of the Habsburg-Lothringen family. It is mostly mentioned in the context of a laughingstock and dying imperial holding of an inbred family nowadays. I would argue that this characterization is inaccurate. It has a long and complicated history which I would rather not go through here in detail because this video will be several hours long and for that context this would be overkill. Very basically what is relevant to us is that in 1848 the Kingdom of Hungary revolted against Habsburg rule. Though the revolution was ultimately lost, the Habsburg found themselves in a very difficult situation. The revolution was only crushed thanks to the intervention of the Russian Empire, and their own domain was very clearly declining. After the disastrous Italian Wars of Independence outside, and the rebellious Hungarian nation, which legally didn't consider the emperor to be their legitimate ruler and compromised much of the empire's land, economy and population on the inside, the imperial government decided to sit down and hammer out a deal. This led to the Compromise of 1867, which established a dual monarchy and gave autonomy to the Hungarian government, which was more or less free to make internal decisions. In the same year, the Hungarian government passed a law of Jewish emancipation, which effectively made Jews equal members of society and Judaism legally equal to Christianity. This was a continuation of several laws dating back to 1840 when Jews were formally recognized and were allowed to migrate in and pick up trades. These were groundbreaking civil rights legislations at the time when in Europe anti-Semitism was extremely rampant. In the West, the likes of French anti-Semitism led to the infamous Dreyfus Affair. In the German states, Prussia and later the unified German Empire, Jews were generally not recognized as equals to Christians for a long time and were subject to anti-Semitic laws, and in the East they were often subject to violent discrimination and pogroms from the Russian Empire. This led to a significant population of Jews moving into the Kingdom of Hungary and closely integrating into Hungarian society, often identifying themselves as Hungarians and tacitly supporting Hungarian autonomy and even independence. This included a lot of skilled laborers and intellectuals who fled from persecution and settled in the country, significantly contributing to a huge economic boom in the kingdom during the late 19th century. This doesn't mean that all was fine though, and there were several flare-ups of anti-Semitic tension that was capitalized on by several politicians who used it to run hate campaigns in service of their political ambitions. The affair in Tiszaeszlár proved to be the last major blood libel case in the country and led to some of the most severe anti-Semitic tensions until the interwar period some 40 years later. That, by the way, eventually culminated in the Holocaust, in which both the Horthy and the Szálasi governments were complicit. Now, it has to be acknowledged before we get into the case itself that, however we might think about this case today, the Kingdom of Hungary and the king's government's interests lied in keeping the status quo and order, not properly prosecuting a politically insignificant criminal trial, leading to political meddling in the case. All of this happened on a backdrop of fighting for universal suffrage, often resulting in violent anti-worker and anti-reform crackdowns from the government, all with the goal of keeping a Christian, aristocratic and bourgeoisie elite in power, and which didn't necessarily reflect the ideals of the general populace, which was much more conservative in this instance compared to the Hungarian elite when it came to Jewish immigration and integration. From the government's part, this was less about tolerance and social justice and more about preserving the established order and upholding their own laws and visions about the country's future. The Kingdom of Hungary was a constitutional monarchy at the time, though emphasis on the monarchy rather than the constitutional part. People had rights and freedoms and privileges, which were often remarkably liberal compared to many contemporary examples. Their voting rights were still very limited. For example, around only 15 to 20% of the population had real voting powers based on wealth and social standing. It's quite a high percentage compared to many examples of the time, but still very low, and we have to keep this in mind as we progress forward in the story. Now, what exactly happened that stirred the nation to such a degree? As I have mentioned, sourcing was not the easiest job ever, but based on what I have found, here is my best attempt at explaining what happened. I will paraphrase and heavily rely on a few particular sources here, like this article, which neatly collected most of the important points of the whole case. For the sake of time, I will also have to leave out some minor details. On April 1st, 1882, a 14-year-old housemaid named Solymosiné Eszter was on a trip to the paint shop to help her landlady, Húri Andrásné, decorate the house for Easter. On her way, she spoke to her sister, who was also a housemaid for one of the town's Jewish families, and this was the last time that she was seen. Given that it was the Sabbath of the eve of Passover, a lot of Jewish people from neighboring towns and villages were present who were not from this town, and were also celebrating the election of new church dignitaries, which contributed to the blood libel claims that the girl was kidnapped and murdered so that her blood can be used for the celebratory matzo. The accusations were also fueled by the fact that her way to and from the paint shop went just in front of the synagogue. After a while, on the same day, her mother, Solymosiné, was increasingly worried about her daughter not returning, so she started searching for her. During her search, she bumped into Scharf József, the synagogue's samesz, or servant, and his wife, who asked her what was going on. After explaining that Eszter was missing, József allegedly answered, "Don't fret, your girl will be found. On Nánáson there was a similar case of child went missing there, and they suspected the Jews there too, and she was found in the fields," to calm the woman down. Though it is uncertain whether or not he used the word "to," or if he truly phrased it this way, many believers in the blood libel claim that without being accused, he was being defensive here, citing it as proof that he had something to do with the girl being missing. Nevertheless, they failed to find her that day, so the next day she reported her missing to the authorities, who ordered a nationwide search for her. After weeks of fruitless searching, the first piece of evidence came on the 30th of April when allegedly the 4-year-old son of the samesz, Scharf József, told a few other children that, quote, his father invited Eszter in the synagogue, they made her sit, tied her, placed a rag in her mouth, washed her, and then they cut her throat. According to the defense, he said this after he was given cake and sweets by the locals who convinced him to say this. According to the leading detective, however, no such persuasory methods were used on the boy to confess this. Quick side note, the official title of the detective was investigating judge, but that is much longer, so let's remain with the detective, just for you not to be confused if you research this later on. However it might be, investigators descended upon the synagogue but failed to find any evidence. With no concrete material proof and only the words of a 4-year-old boy to go by, the case didn't really have strong legs. However, the leading detective, Scharf József, was undeterred. Scharf is personally very important to this case. During the investigation, he was accused of bias, that he fully believed in the blood libels and was convinced about the ritualistic murder taking place, and that he was only searching for evidence to back up this theory instead of conducting an actual investigation determined to find out what happened. He himself recounted in his memoirs that he didn't believe in medieval superstitions and the so-called Jewish witchcraft, and only was convinced that if a murder took place, it was done by a few religiously overzealous Jews, rather than something that the whole Jewish community practiced, though I personally must stress that his memoirs are laced with a lot of anti-Semitic statements and with a healthy dose of blaming the Jews for anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic movements that, according to him, didn't exist in the 19th century until the Jews, quote-unquote, flooded Eastern Europe from Russia and Romania, ranting for several pages how immigration is destroying the country. My personal opinion is that he failed as a detective. His cronies made a proper investigation completely impossible, and his family tried to use the increasingly anti-Semitic backdrop and far-right shift of the 1930s Hungary to clear him from any wrongdoing, criticizing the memoirs of the lead attorney of the defense 30 years after it has been written. The attorney would have answered, of course, if he wouldn't have been dead for 20 years at this point, as well as most people were present during this time, because the memoirs were also published 20 years after the death of Scharf József by his family. But back to the case. Scharf brought in the Scharf family for questioning and seemingly found what he was searching for in the form of the statements of Scharf Moritz, the 13-year-old brother of Samu and son of József. He testified that he has seen the murder take place through a keyhole of a door. The defense later proved with witnesses that the boy was tortured by the investigating gendarme, who beat him with a whip to get a confession out of him. Nevertheless, the boy stuck to his confession on the stand during the trial, which according to the investigator proved that the statements were valid. Now, I'm just a regular interdimensional cosmic horror being, but even I can feel that a 13-year-old boy who was just physically tortured and threatened, probably even told if he doesn't uphold his statements in court there will be consequences, is not necessarily the most admissible evidence in a trial, but really, what the fuck do I know? Quick, only surface relevant fun fact, the Royal Hungarian Gendarme was established originally to provide both rural policing against the increasingly problematic type of horse brigand and roadmen known as betyár, and to have a militarized and reliable group of strikebreakers who can suppress minorities and workers. To this end, only childless, unmarried Hungarian speakers with quote-unquote good morals were recruited, and the recruiters tended to favor rural Christians, and they very specifically wanted to avoid city working class people. They were known to be often violent in their conduct when performing their duties. Moving on, however, this was around the time when the case became a sensation throughout the country and quickly split opinions between those who thought the Jews were guilty, known as anti-Semites, and those who thought they were innocent, known as philo-Semites. Note that these first didn't necessarily carry the same meaning then as they do now. However, with every today's meaning of the word, into the anti-Semitic camp belonged a certain Adamovich József, the Catholic priest of the town, who fully believed in the blood libel and not only held inflammatory sermons in the town church, but using his connections to rural media spread much of the conspiracy theories throughout the whole story. The thing became extremely political too, and Tiszaeszlár's district parliamentary representative, the independent Ono di Géza, was asked to explain to parliament the case and its findings. In came to this picture Representative Istóczy Győző. Istóczy was nominally part of the governing Szabadelvű or Liberal Party, a relatively big tent right-leaning coalition party that was governed the post-compromise Kingdom of Hungary for around 30 years, though he was personally not in good terms with the party's president, Prime Minister Tisza Kálmán, because Istóczy was a hardcore anti-Semite who de facto led a small anti-Semitic faction within the Hungarian parliament, and when I say anti-Semitic, I do mean anti-Semitic. His aggressive views were well known at the time. He funded the Association of Non-Jewish People and spread propaganda leaflets around the country, even advocating for the expulsions of the Jews from the country into the then-named province of Palestine of the Ottoman Empire. This got so bad that apparently he even got into a fistfight with Representative representative Warman Moore, who was the first Jewish member of parliament and the leader of the Jewish community of Pest, which Istotzi subsequently lost and was told by his own party members to rein in his emotions and reflect upon his actions, which he took just a tiny bit of offense to. I even found a mention of a possible duel taking place among them later, but found no explanation or deeper story behind the mention in my search so far, so I don't know if it actually happened. Now, this adorable piece of cake wanted to create political capital from the case and held several inflammatory speeches and continued a campaign of dissemination of anti-Semitic leaflets. However, his already tenuous place in the party was coming under serious pressure as his fellow parliamentarians started telling him that he should shut the fuck up, finding neither much sympathy nor support within the party, and receiving a thorough and literal ass-beating, he decided to break with the party and create the National Anti-Semitic Party. Yes, that was the actual name of the party. You can guess what the ideology was. Meanwhile, the case was developing. On the 18th of June 1882, more than 2 months after the disappearance, a body was discovered by ferrymen in the Tisza River some 30 kilometers from the village. The body, very crucially, had no cut marks around its neck. Now, this is a very controversial part of the case and really where much of the conversation tends to diverge depending on what version of the events you believe. The body was undeniably dressed in Esther's clothing, and when it was shown to the townspeople, many of them did recognize Esther in the 2-month-old hairless corpse that was fished out from the river. Notably, however, her mother and sister said that the body was not hers. This led to a new theory being born. This was a different body, dressed in Esther's clothing. Genius! It couldn't possibly be that the grief-stricken family couldn't or outright refused to recognize their daughter in the corpse, which, again, at that point spent 2 months in the river in the blistering late spring, early summer heat. Now, I have seen bodies which only spent a fraction of that time in water, and let me tell you that identification is not an easy job even nowadays and only really possible with relatively new technological innovations. I really don't want to be too harsh on them, it must have been agonizing to see that, but these conspiracy theories nearly sent innocent people to the gallows in this already terribly mismanaged and biased case. Regardless, after a thorough interrogation by the gendarmes of the ferrymen, none of whom were Hungarian by the way, they admitted to receiving a large sum of money to dress up a body in Esther's clothes and ferry to the place they allegedly found it. Now, who was this exact mysterious benefactor? Where was this large sum of money? Who was the other body then, and where did they get the clothes from is really anyone's guess, just as much as whose plan it was to place the corpse there and then mysteriously find it 2 months later. Regardless, they have upheld this testimony in court, and because of that, many people still claim today that the corpse was not Esther's. Now, continuing with these events, Bari basically brought in the entire Scharf family alongside a few other members of the local Jewish community, seemingly at random. As this happened, the National Office of Israelites, a Jewish NGO based in Budapest, heard about their problems, chief among them that they do not have the funds to organize a proper defense, so the NGO took it upon itself to solve this problem, and boy did they. They turned to lawyer and member of parliament Ötvös Károly, who was at the time considered one of the best criminal defense lawyers of the country. Now, Ötvös was reluctant at first. The situation was turning violent throughout the entire country, already resulting in deadly riots that specifically targeted Jewish and Philosemite businesses and resulted in martial law being enacted at first in several castle counties and eventually in the whole country. His office, career, reputation, and life was going to be under threat if he does take the case, but after personally going to Tiszaeszlár and speaking to the accused, he decided that he will take over the defense. He and his office even got their own guards in the form of a small Jewish volunteer defense force led by Golystein János, so that was covered at least. Such militia forces were not uncommon during the time on all sides, don't worry about it. Ötvös himself was also a very interesting character in his own right. A prolific writer during his later years and a member of a very revolutionary liberal-minded noble faction, he was a firm believer in the principles of equality. On and off he was working in and was leading the Independence and 48 party, which was a radical liberal nationalist political party advocating for, well, a lot of things, but generally they were the more radically anti-Austrian party, which broke itself apart and reformed multiple times during its existence, mainly on the issue of one wing of the party favoring autonomy and the other independence. The only thing they really agreed on is that they fucking hated Tisza and the Szabadelvi part. The court case started relatively late on the 19th of June 1883 in Nyíregyháza, more than a year after Esther's disappearance. 15 people stood accused, 4 for murder, including Scharf József and the Synagogue's Mazgiak Scharf Solomon, basically a butcher who makes sure the meat is kosher, 6 for complicity in murder, and an additional 5 for aiding and abetting criminals. The prosecution was led by Seifer Ede, who himself vocally didn't believe in the ritualistic killing of Christians by Jews, calling them fairy tales, and according to him took the case because it was his duty. His appointment was disputed somewhat over the years. The Prime Minister, with the appointment of a politically neutral prosecutor, wished to rein in his notoriously anti-Semitic, not as much as Isóci, but still, justice minister, and wished to stave off accusations from the international press that his country's justice system is biased and barbaric. Yes, this is part of the political meddling I was talking about. At this point, the case was making international headlines and turning a lot of heads towards Tisza's government and towards the Kingdom of Hungary, and the whole trial became as much about the accused as much about the Hungarian justice system and the international standing of the country. Because of this, the court and the prosecution was accused of being biased towards the defense then and the years following the trial. Nevertheless, the case went forward. As I have mentioned, so far there was no material proof that a murder even took place. There was a body identified as Esther with no signs of trauma or wound that would suggest murder, there was no evidence in the synagogue, and the defense argued that the entire investigation was biased, proving that all of the supposed witnesses were savagely beaten and threatened to give a confession, and that their stories not really lined up. Eötvös famously held a 7-hour-long speech exploring the history of blood libels, discrimination, false accusations, and the biased and harmful medieval superstitions that caused them, stating that the entire case has absolutely no basis. The 3 judges unanimously acquitted the accused. Solymosiné, Esther's mother, refused to back down, however, and appealed the case with her attorney, which eventually went all the way to the Curia, the Royal Hungarian Supreme Court, where the verdict was upheld, ending the whole mess. The case led to a serious flare-up of anti-Semitism in the country. Several deadly riots ensued as anti-Semitic mobs wanted to attack Jewish-owned businesses and had to be cracked down under martial law, even resulting in the military being deployed and firing on crowds, leading to some deaths. Several more blood libel claims were made in the ensuing few years, all of which has proven fraudulent and none of them making into the courts. Istóci Győző, as I have mentioned, created the National Anti-Semitic Party and riding on this wave managed to land 4% and 17 mandates in parliament during the 1884 parliamentary elections, though the party eventually weakened and collapsed a few years later. Eötvös Károly became internationally famous for his actions. Many, however, used his position as the leading defense attorney to undermine his political campaign, which led to him temporarily losing his seat in the next election, later regaining it and writing an account of the story and generally musing about the history of anti-Semitism in a book titled The Great Trial, which has been going on for 1,000 years and is still not over, which is an interesting book that I would recommend if not for the fact that, as far as I know, it is only available in Hungarian. Learn Hungarian, I guess. As I've mentioned, he had a vested personal incentive to paint the case in the worst light possible, though I find his accounts much more reliable than those of Bari. As to what has really transpired on Tiszaeszlár, we don't really know. Eötvös, after being questioned about it, speculated that the girl might have committed suicide, a conclusion generally accepted by most sources I have found. As I have mentioned, the case was a complete failure from a technical standpoint, however. The detective, Barry, failed to actually build the case, handing a murder case to the prosecution without any real material evidence that a murder really took place, basically already deciding that the Jews did murder the girl and trying to find evidence of this happening, rather than building a conclusion from the evidence found. So, what really happened, we might accurately never know. I would like to end this video by citing something Eötvös has wrote in one of his books titled Journey Around the Balaton, which I feel is not only important to what transpired here, but also reflects upon many issues we face today. Hey, Jew! Even your name is ugly. If somebody has to be cursed, it is you they curse. If somebody can be beaten, it is you they beat. If sacrifice is needed for 100 public matters, it is you they expect the sacrifice from. You can't be angry for anything. For your complaining, they laugh at you. You have 1,000 in poverty. They don't pity you. You have 10 rich. They envy you. Your bad people will always be mentioned to you. For your good people, everybody is miserly with their praise. Thank you for watching my video. If you have enjoyed what you have seen, like, comment and subscribe. I've been Kane, and behind my mask, eternity.